right, good day, everybody. I'm Jeff Edwards for the University of Wyoming Extension, along with Jeremiah Vardaman. Hello, Jeremiah.
Good morning.
Glad you're with us today.
Morning.
And our third partner is Jenny Thompson. You probably won't be able to see her, but you might be able to hear her today. And we thank her for doing what she does because she keeps everything running. And our guest today is Matt Jolivet. He is the Assistant Supervisor for Natrona County Weed and Pest. And we'll be talking to him about weeds, and he'll be talking with us about weeds. But before we do that, just as a reminder, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Zoom, if you have a question, take your mouse and scroll over the screen, and at the bottom some buttons will pop up and you can ask questions using the chat feature or the Q&A feature. And if you're watching on Facebook and you have a question for Matt or either of us, any of us, go ahead and use the comments section in Facebook, and we can bring those questions forward to Matt or whoever they're directed to and try to get them answered for you. But I think we have a good lineup, good program today. We appreciate you being here, Matt. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thanks for joining us.
All righty. Well, hi, Jeff and Jeremiah. Jenny, thank you very much for having me. 'Tis the season, I guess, to talk about springtime weed control. And, you know, the spring weed control is so much more than just what we do in the spring to control our weeds, but we really need to keep our weed control in mind for any of our land management activities.
And that spring control, Matt, as you're pulling up your PowerPoint, that it doesn't matter how small or large of acreage you're talking about, right? I mean, everybody
Absolutely.
has it. Everybody probably needs to be paying attention. This is a good time of year where we're starting to thaw out, warm up, but also getting these little snowstorms coming through, bringing us some moisture.
Yep. And absolutely, it's just, you want to spend, you know, you're doing your work if you've only got a few weeds to control, but it should be a standard part of your activities. So absolutely. And
so where do we start with our spring control?
Well, we really have to make a plan. We have to have a good idea of what we're dealing with. First and foremost, we have to ID what we want to control and setting some goals for the site. So whether you're dealing with a lawn situation, a crop, pasture, things like that, we have to keep our goals in mind, and understanding the limits of your time and our special growing season here in Wyoming, which is typically short, will really help you find out what type of activities you want to get done. And then, of course, we have to be using proper products, proper control methodology. And if you're using a herbicide, you know, we're going to have to get one that's appropriately labeled for what we want to do.
Perfect. So yeah. I see on your slide here, properly ID target weed. Can you explain that to us? Well,
absolutely. Whenever we want to control a specific plant, typically we're trying to exploit a portion of its life cycle. And so, you know, we don't necessarily all need to be botanists, but we need to be accurate enough in my, and I have nothing against botanists, that's good. But some people do get nervous when you start going into the Latin terminology. But the important part is really to be as specific as we need to understand the life cycle here.
Well,
way to go!
Right?
You've already alienated one segment of our view.
Oh, darn.
That's only Jeff. It's okay.
It's okay, Matt. Go ahead.
That's all right.
But it's important though, because everybody calls something different, right?
Absolutely.
Like, plants can have multiple names. Animals have multiple names, and we just need to make sure we're talking the same language and specifically know what we're trying to control, because that matters down the road, right? Well, how we do it.
Absolutely, yes, it does. And it's easiest if you can go down to that genus, species classification. You are not doing anything wrong. It's only going to help you in the end. So did I fix it there? Are you comfortable with that?
Perfect.
Okay. And we have a couple of really good examples, I think, dealing with weeds. One in particular that comes to mind is cheatgrass. I think everybody knows what it is. Its Latin name is Bromus tectorum, but I know cheatgrass, cheat, Japanese brome have all been kind of referred to as cheatgrass. I've heard people call it buffalo grass, which is, you're really stepping on another species name there. So we really just have to define that we're interested in managing not to have an invasive annual grass that is typically, at least in our neck of the woods, a winter annual. So a lot of people know cheatgrass, they've had it in their socks, they don't like it, but what a lot of people don't know is it actually germinated in the fall in most cases. So that really is going to affect your management, and we're doing a lot of cheatgrass treatments actually in the fall part of the year.
So Matt, sorry to
yes.
interrupt, but last week we had below zero weather. This week we've had positive 50s, 70s, whatever around the state. Could a person actually go out? You can see cheat that's germinated at this point in time.
Yes.
Could a person actually go out and mechanically remove them or chemically treat them and try to get ahead of some of those spots?
Absolutely, they definitely could. This would be the time of year to get on top of it. One of the reasons cheatgrass is so competitive is that it already has a root system in the ground ready to exploit those nice days. So doing mechanical control this time of year would be a great option. It probably doesn't have a seed head bolted on it yet to be able to mow that off. And then the only consideration I would kind of refer you again to the chemical label is some of those chemicals don't provide very good control when there's not an actively growing period of time. So you typically have to have an extended period of a number of days. So just be watching for that. But yes, you can absolutely get a jump on your cheatgrass this time of year.
Well, and this time of year, Matt, I'm sure you get this probably year round. But about this time of year, I start getting my first phone calls from now until about October or November. And everybody's like, yeah, I got a weed in my field and it's got white flowers or yellow flowers. Oh, you know that one. I don't.
Yes.
Just by telling me what flower color it is, I don't know what plant it is. It's very, very hard. And so if somebody doesn't know what plant they have or what they're dealing with, if it's a weed or not a weed, how can they find that out?
Well, there are a lot of good resources that you could do on your own online. But I do caution you against doing that, is there's a lot of misinformation out there or difficult to sort through ID things. So take everything you hear from the internet with a grain of salt. This program excluded, I guess. But it's important that you identify that. You could take a picture of it. Everybody carries a camera around in their pocket with their smartphone, or if they're still using a flipper, those still have some cameras on them. So don't be afraid to take a picture. I know that Weed and Pest, a lot of the districts will do site visits at free or very, very minimal cost. Typically, the best ones will provide you with a written weed management plan and get into some of that planning. But and then the extension service also probably does some of that, right?
Right. Yeah, we do. We don't know. Not all of our counties can get out like you guys do and get a site visit. But for me personally, I try and really work off the phone. I have them send me photos, have them bring me plants into my office just to make my time more efficient and be able to serve more clientele. And if it's still just, I can't handle it that way, then I make a site visit. But all of those are really important. And I guess from my perspective, the more of the plant I can see, the better, right?
Yes.
Even the roots, which we don't always think about. I love it when people bring me plants in and they cut the top off. Well, what's the bottom look like? Those
Right.
leaves matter, the stems matter, the roots matter, all of it. The more of it I can see, the better chance I have of IDing it properly.
Absolutely. And these pictures that you see on your screen right now, you might want to include a picture of the site overall as well. That will give a lot of clues to what its growth form is like, and potentially if you're dealing with a, we'll just call them one of the bad boys, a difficult to control weed. Getting a good overall picture of the site helps greatly.
Yeah, nice landscape photo. And you can actually see, oh, there's only 2 or 3 in the photo, or man, that's the whole acreage, right?
Yes.
Get that landscape view, and then maybe a close-up of the entire plant, and then maybe a close-up of the flowers. Just some of those different level photos can really help. Yeah, I agree.
Yep, absolutely. And so again, this we've got many species of annual mustard. I think there's 500 species that probably around North America. And knowing whether these growth forms can be summer annuals, winter annuals, so getting a good ID on some of that can be important. There's also perennial annuals that are very different. At least if you're doing a herbicide application, you might have to employ some different chemistries to take those.
And there's a lot of mustards. The one I think of is blue mustard. It's like usually one of the first mustards it's just prevalent in the spring, comes up. I don't think it's the first up, but it's very common in the area.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So after we've ID'd it, what else do we need to think about, or where do you want to take us next?
I want to think a little bit about just to juxtapose the winter annuals. Let's look at something more of a summertime annual species where you're going to have these immature plants start to come out in late June, early July, and everybody I think on this program would know about puncture vine or goat heads. This is a very ubiquitous plant around the state. It causes a lot of issues. You certainly don't want to be riding your bicycle over these matted thorns. And
you'd only do it once.
You would only do it once, yes.
Well, and you don't want to walk on them either, especially barefoot.
Absolutely. And one of the struggles of this plant is it has a broad range of what time of year this is going to germinate. And we typically see it in Natrona County a little bit later. But to give you an example of how plastic this plant can be, I had a gentleman come in recently and he said, "How do you get rid of those goat heads?" And of course, I have to ask some additional questions. And I said, "Well, where are you located?" And he says, "Arizona." And I said, "Okay. All right, so I'm thinking that warmer weather, you're typically earlier in the spring, which would follow most logic to have earlier germination." But he said, "No, we get our rains in the monsoon season later in late summer, early fall." And so this was really they have germination later on in the year. So. And then without having the killing frost of wintertime, I think a lot of these plants are pretty plastic and when they're able to show up. So you've got to keep an open mind for summer annuals, and a lot of the more weedy type species will be able to exploit those resources if they're there.
We got a question for you, Matt. Hold on. I'm pretty sure Jeff, myself, and you understand what we're talking about when we're saying winter annuals, summer annuals, but let's define those just in case we have any participants on that don't know the difference of those.
Sure. So a winter annual would be a species that would germinate in the late summer or fall of the year. And when we look at our moisture and temperature regimes in the state, typically we get a wet spring, right? And then we get a hot, dry summer that doesn't allow for a whole lot of plant growth. So your plant growth is limited to kind of the spring, early summer, and then again, you get another flush of moisture and wet soils in the fall when we
And
start
cooler
getting
temperatures.
and cooler temperatures. So
Yep.
these plants are able to kind of pick whether they exploit the beginning of the year or the end of the year. And winter annuals will generally germinate, start their growth as a really, really small plant in the fall of the year, overwinter in a kind of a semi-dormant, dry state. It may not even look like it's alive, and then it already has a root system down into the ground, ready to go as soon as we get moisture in the spring.
And so you already said cheatgrass as a good example of a winter annual. It germinates in the fall, it grows a little bit, and it kind of just lays dormant a little bit through the winter, and then the springtime it finishes its life cycle. But it's an annual plant because it only lives for approximately a year.
Yes, yes, yeah. One seed head will be made that's its goal, I guess, as an individual plant. Yeah.
So annuals are trying to just reproduce through seeds, and they're just growing up as fast as they can, throw out as many seeds as they can. And so that would be the same with this summer annual, correct? But instead of germinating in the fall, they're germinating in the summer and growing through the summer and then probably done in the fall. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. And we use done in a loose term because this plant in particular has a very long-lived seed. And we're talking not a few years, we're talking more on the order of 50 years or even longer. So
good news. You're just a ray of sunshine today.
It is good. It is good news. So if we have to think about that a little differently too, we in the weed management terms, we like to use a term called seed bank. And literally, just like your piggy bank, your soil is going to take in all those seeds that these plants keep producing, and they go down in the soil ready to propagate in the future, and they have them there. So when it comes down to control of these annual plants, our most important goal is to prevent them from going to seed and adding to that seed bank.
So that's our first line of defense, is any plant that we do not want in our area, we need to try and stop as much seed production as possible.
Very first line of defense. Stop it before it goes to seed. And you'll start, it really, we said that this seed lasts 50 years. I don't want to leave it to be all doom and gloom. Obviously, the fate of a seed can have many different outcomes. A seed could get buried, picked up, and moved somewhere else. You could throw them in the trash. And then the vigor of these seeds will taper down over that time. So if if a plant makes 100 seeds, that doesn't mean 100 of them are going to grow, but it is something to take into consideration when dealing with annuals.
Especially with annuals, like you're saying, it's just, if we can control the seeds and the seed bank, most likely we're going to control the plant, because if there's no seeds, there's no plants, right? The plant only lives for about a year. The seeds
Absolutely
can live longer. We got a comment from Facebook from Linda K. She says, goat heads are the Legos of the weed world. And that's fantastic. I had not put that together, but I agree 100%. If you've ever stepped on a Lego in the middle of the night in particular, oh my gosh, it'll take you to the ground. But I agree, goat heads are there.
I'm going to have to tell my wife about that when I get home, because she'll appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're good on summer annuals. What's next?
Well, and to highlight the point that we need to make sure we properly ID the life cycle, a very good example, and this would be predominantly, we would get the question in a lawn setting, is crabgrass versus quackgrass. So our lawn is a perennial grass system, and most of us, when we try to manage that, we're going to get a nice, flat, even, and it may contain 1, 2, or 3 species. Kentucky bluegrass is a common one that comes to mind. And so when we get these areas, everybody's seen something that looks similar to the picture on the left, and they say, I have crabgrass. So when it comes to dealing with different types of grasses in a grass system, it's very difficult. And most of us don't want to be tearing up our sod, plowing in a lawn scenario. So the way that this is normally dealt with is you would buy some kind of crabgrass preventer. And unfortunately, the mechanism for that working is to prevent the growth, or to prevent the germination of the seed you put down. So if we misidentify crabgrass and quackgrass, which look very, very similar and are very difficult to tell apart, we have not effectively controlled anything in that system at all. So not to say that if you have a failure of your control of crabgrass, it's always quackgrass, but that simply highlights the point that we have to know what we're dealing with. And it's more, sometimes more than just having a feeling about it that makes the difference. And so we won't be able to use that type of chemical control on a perennial grass in a perennial grass system.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And I think let's define perennial just for the sake of being thorough, and then we'll go into the next comment.
Absolutely. So when we look at different life cycles, that we had talked about annual weeds, there are annuals and perennials, and then a little tiny area in between called biennials. And we need to think of this more of a spectrum of plant growth than an individual category, because some of these plants will a little more tend to perennial, a little more tend to annual. But for the most part, your annual weeds are going to use their reproductive strategies to try and create seed. And they do this one time. And it can either be in the height of the growing season in the summer, or in the winter where they overwinter, but they're going to do this one time. And on the other side of the spectrum is a perennial. And so this plant is going to use its reproductive strategies to create large root systems. It may have some seed, but we might see a more vegetative propagation. And so those roots are going to turn into other plants. And we've all seen this with those aggressive perennials that we plant in our flower beds. It does not mean that one is better or worse or more weedy or less weedy than the other. It's simply talking about the growth form that it has. And then to complicate it a little bit more, right in the middle of annuals and perennials, we have a biennial system where it really is taking place over 2 growing seasons. You will get a basal rosette, which is a plant part that's growing on the ground. It looks like a big satellite dish or solar panel where it's taking in all of those sun rays, and it's going to make sugars and store it in a large root system. You can think of a carrot, a potato, and it stores it in a big starchy root system. And then the following growing season, bam, up goes a seed stalk. And so in that respect, you'll be more like an annual plant and really dedicate all of that reserved energy to forming a seed head.
Great. That was a great definition. Yeah, totally. I can't add anything to that. That was an awesome job, Matt.
Well, good. Yeah, thanks. And the only thing I can really say about that is you have to, sometimes the weeds don't fit into a neat category, particularly those that we view as negative weed. And so just to recap our annuals, the key to controlling the annual plants, the one season plants, is preventing any deposits into that seed bank. So get rid of the seed. healthy, desirable vegetation can provide a competitive edge, and that's going to be your primary goal. We talked about controlling cheatgrass seed. Mechanical control is going to be an option. If these are very small plants early in the season, you might have the opportunity to use lower herbicide rates. But again, be sure and check the label to make sure you're going to accomplish your goals.
Well, and you want to apply that herbicide. I think you're going to talk about it a little later, but make sure that herbicide is listed for the area that you're doing the control in, and actually will control the plant that you're wanting controlled, but also not injure the plants that you want to have present, right? So it's a combination of things.
It is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Annual plants in bare areas are not always a problem. Many people come in and they say, I want to deal with these weeds because they're unsightly, and they typically are. But again, if we haven't ID'd it correctly, we don't know how competitive that would be. So the answer may be put something else in that to occupy that space. It's kind of interesting, but I'm going to introduce a term here called a ruderal, and a ruderal is a first successional species. So its whole purpose is to exploit those scarce resources, and it tends to be more capable of handling disturbance. So when we have those sites that we don't have a dense grass sod lawn, or we clear an area, or it could be even a horse loafing area where it likes to go. If you get continual disturbance, you are selecting for these early successional species, and they're called ruderals. So if our management leads to that continual disturbance, you are automatically going to get ruderals, and they tend to be the unsightly plants that we see. So just have an understanding that they're not all bad, right? The answer may be
they serve a purpose, right?
They serve a purpose, and so they're modifying the ecosystems to get these more perennial type species in there.
Right. And so more disturbed sites, you're going to typically see more annual weeds in that presence. So off the top of my head, I can go with cheatgrass, like you've mentioned already, would be a good one.
Yes.
Kochia, Russian thistle, right?
Lamb's
I
quarter.
think the other, what was that, Jeff?
Lamb's quarter.
Lamb's quarter. Yep. I
Yes.
think we had a comment earlier from Facebook that lamb's quarter is somebody's bane of existence. They struggle with it. But
Yes.
the two things with knowing if a weed is an annual plant, I guess from my perspective, Matt, and I'd love to have yours, but two things is one, first, it, at least on my end of things, it helps me identify that plant. And that's why we need to know what that root system is, because that helps me determine if it's an annual or a perennial.
Yes.
In terms of control, it never fails. About every year I get a call. Somebody thinks that they have Roundup resistant kochia. Well, it's July and the plant is done, and it
Yes.
will not absorb the chemical, and the chemical does not control the plant because it is pretty much finished its lifespan.
Yes.
And so knowing that annual plant and knowing when control measures are worth doing or not doing. It's the two things I think of with annuals, in particular, the way you're talking.
Absolutely, and we call this a revenge spray in the in the industry. So typically, when this above ground biomass on these annuals and biennials get developed, they don't look good, and we want to, as land managers, do something to get rid of it, and we go ahead and spray it and think our herbicide's not working, but it's simply too late. The plant has accomplished what it wanted to do. So absolutely, Jeremiah.
Yeah, we just want to drown the plant in herbicide just to get some vengeance on it because we hate it so much, right?
Yes. Yep.
Way more herbicide than is necessary if it's under proper conditions and control.
Yes. And
Great.
so
What's next?
When you got The next would be everybody has thistles, and we all know we have those darn thistles, right? Again, we really have to be able to identify what kind of thistle it is because it's going to affect its life cycle. And a few good examples are Canada thistle, Scotch thistle, and musk thistle. We have 2 biennials and a perennial on here. So Canada thistle is a perennial thistle, and it's going to devote its resources to making a big root system. It is going to make a lot of seeds. A lot of them are not viable. That's not its reproductive strategy. It loves agricultural fields because people are turning them over and plowing all the time. And guess what that does? It just makes it angry. And quite literally, you are chopping up that root system, and you're going to make new plants pop up everywhere. So very different control from Scotch thistle, which is a biennial type thistle. And so it fits in the middle of those annuals and perennials, and you're going to have a large basal rosette that takes in those sun rays and makes a big starchy root system that's ready to go and make a seed head. But it only reproduces by seed. So if you can simply cut off those seed heads, you're controlling that plant, and you're going to not make any deposits into your seed bank. Musk thistle on the upper right is the same way. So we have to know what kind of thistle we're dealing with before we get into thistle control.
And knowing that difference, that's a very good understanding of it. Whereas Canadian thistle, if we're out there chopping it up, maybe with a shovel, trying to dig it up, or plowing, like you said, doing tillage actions with a rototiller, we might be making our situation worse, right?
Yes.
However, but we're in the biennial with a musk thistle, Scotch thistle, we have a chance of possibly just cutting that taproot off, and we have good control.
Yes.
Is that a fair analogy between the two?
That's an excellent analogy. Yes.
And that's where it comes down to that proper ID, right? Thistles look very similar. They all have purple flowers, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're very spiny. There's different characteristics if you know what you're looking for, but understanding what you have to begin with can really help someone like myself, but also the individual know how to control that plant and maybe not how to make it worse.
Yes. And this is a perfect opportunity. If you've got a thistle on your property, take a picture of it, come in the weed and pest. We'll be able to get you set up with a good control plan.
So even if it's dried down in a skeleton form is usually how we term it, it's last year's plants.
Yes.
Right? You guys still have a good chance of IDing that?
We do with the thistles, absolutely. I would say it's not ideal, but we have a good chance of identifying what you're dealing.
You could at least start maybe teasing out, is it a biennial or is it the perennial Canadian thistle?
Yes. Yep.
And that's the first level of it, right?
Absolutely. And if you put your leather gloves on and you are able to pluck these plants out of the ground, the root systems on the biennials are going to be a very large starchy taproot, and you may not be able to get too much out without a shovel and a little bit of sweat equity, but that would give an indication of what you're dealing with.
Especially if there's only a few of them, right? Like if there's only 4 or 5 of them, we're not talking acres and acres of this stuff. Just popping it out with a shovel might be all you need to do, especially for ID. So.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. What's next, Matt?
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the biennial weeds. They're going to complete their life cycle in 2 growing seasons. And again, that doesn't mean they follow the fiscal year like your tax accountant does. They're going to exploit 2 of those moisture regimes. Mechanical control can be very effective here. Seed bank reduction, again, because these are only reproducing by seed, we don't want to make any deposits in that seed bank.
Well, and a question on that, Matt. So now, if I understand correctly, you said that these biennials only produce seed on the 2nd season. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I can have a chance of getting ahead of that seed bank with these, just because they're not as prolific with seed production like our annuals.
Yes, yes, you can
Okay.
absolutely get out early. You may have some of those solar collection devices, or rosettes we call them, on the ground, and they'll typically be nearby to your patch of the dead standing weeds from previous years. But again, this brings up a very good point. If you're able to even draw a rudimentary map, or have an idea of where these weeds are occurring, you'll know where to focus your efforts the next year. So our memories, we all think they're great, but it's best to write it down if you can, or take a picture of it. Yeah.
I
And
know
then,
my memory is not that good. I have to write about everything down, it seems like, anymore. I don't trust my memory.
we do, and if you're in any kind of agriculture, this is the time of year where you get busy. Keep that in mind. You don't want to have to be doing surveys of when you're busy in the spring. You having that map in your off season is really going to help you in your weed control.
Yeah, if you got any livestock, you're lambing or calving now, spring field preparations coming up. It looked like we were going to have it next tomorrow, but then now this new front's coming in, so that might put us off another week, but we'll just have to see.
Absolutely, yeah. And we need to not forget about the competitive, desirable vegetation. So if we don't put any inputs in getting something that we want there, we're going to go back to those ruderal type species. So keep that in mind when you're making your plan.
I always heard a great comment, and I've always enjoyed it and appreciated it, but manage for what you want, the desired plants that are there. And if you focus on that management and having what you desire in that area, may it be a pasture or a garden or a flower bed or lawn, whatever that landscape is, whatever you want there, just by doing that practice, you're already implementing a pretty good start to weed management.
Yes.
Great. What's next?
And now finally, to round out kind of our annuals, biennials, and perennials, we look at the perennial species, which just as a refresher, these are putting their reproductive investment, shall we say, on large, deep root systems that are a little bit less geared towards seed production. So a perennial is not specific enough to know whether it makes seeds or not, but these will tend to be more geared towards giant root systems, which really affects their management. You're going to have very limited options in the mechanical control department because of these starch reserves down in the soil. You're not almost exclusively in the chemical category, but chemical is probably going to be a part of control of these types of weeds. And so if you come in and want to get a plan going, properly identify it, we can definitely try to limit the amount of chemical inputs, but just be aware that with these, you're probably going to have some chemical inputs. A number of perennials that come to mind are purple loosestrife. This is a plant that has a lot of lookalikes, but purple loosestrife is going to almost always have its feet wet. And what I mean by that is it's basically an aquatic or semi-aquatic plant. So if you think you have purple loosestrife and it's out on the hillside where you get 12 inches of rain, it's probably not purple loosestrife.
It's unfortunate that purple loosestrife is such an attractive plant.
Oh, it is. And I believe it was an escaped ornamental, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that is something to be cautious with. Another one that I'm very familiar with in the central part of the state is Russian knapweed. This is a plant that just loves to get in an area and has no problem being there for 100 years if it's left uncontrolled. again, these are kind of the bad boys of the list, and they both fall on a list called the noxious weed list. So what that is they're weeds in the legal sense. So a governing body has said, we're going to make funds available and legislate these weeds control. And they tend to be more on the perennial side.
And they're on that noxious weed list also because of the economic damage that they have to the local economy or to the landscape in that area. And so I think that category, if I understand right, Matt, is just reserved for those types of species that are going to cause the most economic damage to our state in various fashions, right? It could be wildlife habitat, it could be agricultural valuation and economics, it could be recreation, and just poor for the environment, right? And so there's a big impact from those species, and thus they're regulated and managed on a governing body.
Yes, absolutely. And that also helps with a collective effort on dealing with these weeds on this noxious weed list is more effective than a patchwork of control. And some of these weed management plans for these perennials can be quite a bit more extensive than your annual weed control. So we need to make sure we're not stepping on our neighbors, and we all have to be bought into the control of these perennial species.
And in a lot of situations, the weed control or weed management, it's larger than our property or larger than ourselves. It might be a drainage, it might be a specific area of the county or part of the state. And if we don't have everybody on board, it can make it challenging. And I know all of us have probably been in those situations of, dang it, I get those phone calls of people like, well, you just need to tell my neighbor to control their weeds. And
yes,
it's a tough situation. It's not always on our individual property.
Yeah, and sometimes the strategy is to work with your neighbors to try to control the problem. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to control it or manage
it.
Why not get that help and try to be as successful as you can?
Yeah, team up together. Great.
So these perennial weeds grow for 2 or more growing seasons. They typically reduce from rootstocks or stems. So if you go ahead and pluck one of these out of the ground and you have as much below ground biomass as you do on the top, chances are you might be dealing with a perennial type weed. These can be difficult or impossible to control mechanically. And in fact, getting that control measure incorrect may actually lead to making your problem worse, because you're dragging those reproductive roots around. Most of the state designated noxious weed list, more than half of them are perennials. So they are more economically impactful, these. And the light at the end of the tunnel is these weeds do offer a control possibility in the fall, a little bit more than the annuals and the biennials typically. The primary reason is in the fall, they're trying to take their last bit of those sun rays, make carbohydrates, and add to that prolific root system. And what we can do is exploit that to get our chemical down into the root system. I think you guys are familiar with Canada thistle and convolvulus arvens. Some of these. See, I'm stuck on those Latin names. These plants can have extensive root systems. You've seen some of those studies, haven't you?
Yeah, the root systems can be as big as a person underground, and they're just elaborate, big, massive root systems. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So if we can get chemical down into those deep depths, we can be successful at their control.
Well, and with those perennials, we have to kill the roots. I think what you're trying to get at. We have to kill the roots, or they're just going to keep coming back from the roots. And so at least I look at it as that mechanical control of if we're digging up those perennial plants, it's almost like a whack-a-mole game. They just keep popping back up. You chop them down, they pop back up. And sometimes in the case of Canadian thistle in particular, you can actually be making the situation worse by having more growth points off of those roots and having more stems and stalks coming up out of that root system. And so just again, proper ID, go in and talk and get some management strategies to help. But with most of those noxious weeds, very much the perennials, you're in for a fight. It's not a one and done type thing. Usually if you have them and if they're well established, we're in there for a few years before we can start maybe getting a handle on them.
Yes.
Matt and I chatted about this a couple days ago. It could be a generational fight.
Yes, yes. Yes.
Depending on the species, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But again, so we don't leave this with kind of the Debbie Downer part of the conversation. Come in to your weed and pest. Typically we'll have some cost shares and things to help you if you have these subset of weeds. So yeah, absolutely. We'll help you with that generational fight. Absolutely. There's help out there. And so now that we have a good handle on the different types of weeds that we could be dealing with, setting these realistic goals and timelines is absolutely essential. As Jeff mentioned, we hope it's not a generational battle, but it could be. There's really no silver bullet or one-shot chemical that we can give you that's going to prevent you from having to worry about weeds on a yearly basis. And I pick my words pretty carefully there, because there is things that do provide a high level of control, but it's going to be a constant vigilance after that.
Well, and that's what most people want, right? We want that fast self-gratification, right? What do I spray on it? How do I control this? I just want to kill it.
Yes.
Just tell me what to do to kill it, and then I can move on. And that can be done on certain plants, but not all of them. And so knowing what you have, yeah, you might have to readjust that focus and be like, you got a couple years of control here, or multiple years of control. And like Jeff said, some of those patches got well established and it's generational.
Right.
But there are success stories. So
yes, absolutely. And certain weeds can remain in the soil for up to 50 years. So, and even longer than that, really. So best case scenario is if you can avoid making deposits to your seed bank, manage, like you said, for the species that you want there, and then be just hyper vigilant for any weeds that come along, or even emerging threats around your property. If you can do those three things, you're gonna have a successful time, and weed control is not gonna take a lot of your springtime.
We've had
becomes part of the spring chores, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, Jeremiah. We had a guest last year who mentioned that healthy turf is your best defense against weeds. So, if it's being well watered, if it's well fertilized, if it's growing aggressively, it'll outcompete your weeds in most cases.
Yeah.
I think that, he was a great host and or great guest in our show. And I really love that point that he talked about. We were talking, Matt, we were specifically talking turf and lawn management. And that was his approach, is proper management, fertilizer, irrigation. Making a healthy lawn is your best number one defense against weeds. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I can't argue that. That's a good one.
Yeah. And then we're also trying to make sure that our control measures, those are also a disturbance event, whether it be chemical, whether you're burning it, mowing. We're going to try not to create bare areas, because again, we go back to those rooterals, they're going to want to be there. So if you don't want those unsightly, non-uniform plants in there, just know that whatever your disturbance you're putting in there, you're going to go back to that, go back to those ruderal type species. So think about what's going to happen to the site, and try not to use a sledgehammer for something you need a small ball peen hammer for. So right. And if you're trying to revegetate, try again. You're going to have failures here in our climate, especially if you're in one of the more difficult, low moisture, cold parts of the state. So keep at it, do your research, and try to find something that works for you.
And you know, like you mentioned, Matt, in our environment, in some situations, it can take up to 3 years or longer before a turf situation actually fills in enough, is healthy enough to basically, for lack of a better term, defend itself against invaders.
Sure.
Before it really starts taking off and doing what it needs to do.
Absolutely, yes.
Establishment is tough, and the more limited your resources are for establishment, it makes it that much harder. So if you have a lack of water or lack of nutrients or anything of that, growing season's a part of it, which we have no control over.
Right.
Yeah, it all plays a part, but keep after it. It can be done. So
yes,
fabulous. With that, Matt, I don't think we missed any questions. Do you have anything on your end, Jeff?
No, I'm not seeing any additional questions.
Well, great. I think I'll just close up the show then. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. This was a great show. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Jeremiah. I appreciate it. And Jeff, yeah, thank you for having me on. And again, just don't forget about your local weed and pest district. A lot of the counties do have rental equipment you can use, and come in, have a cup of coffee, and start a weed management plan.
This is the perfect time of year to do that. It's a good start to the new year. Spring hasn't quite sprung yet, but it's getting close. So yeah, perfect comments. I appreciate that, Matt. Thank you for everyone. We really appreciate you coming and being here. Well, I just got a question right as we're closing up here, Matt. They said they have stork's bill.
Stork's bill.
Spray for stork's bill now.
Yes, absolutely. Because we're dealing with a winter annual. A lot of those, and you have to be able to identify them. They'll be very, very small. Is this in a turf setting?
I don't know. They didn't say that.
Okay, so just make sure that you're going out, taking a look at what you've got. This is going to be one that probably is okay germinating again in the spring. So if you do a kind of an early season control activity, be prepared to do it again when we get the moisture in the spring. But yes,
they said yes, it is in a turf.
It is in a turf. Yep. So you're probably going to be going to a more selective type chemical and avoid the big hammer of the kill all. You know, just read your label.
And you can do it just a spot spray, just to that area, not to the entire lawn, it sounds
You
like.
can, absolutely.
Great.
Yep.
Well, we want to thank everybody for coming and joining and being a part of this. We thank our participants. This is why we do these programs, is for you out in the state. And so we really appreciate that. Jeff, if you have a second, if you could throw in our evaluation link into the comments box and the chat box, that would be great. But for barnyards and backyards, if you'll stop sharing your screen there, Matt, I'll pop mine up. Give me a second here.
Okay.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen. So hopefully all of you already know about our Barnyards and Backyards website. Go to there. It's just loaded with information here. Here on the left is a tab called Treasure Trove of Information. It's all broken out by category. Really good resource for you. As well, on that, we have, I'm gonna have to scroll down here, Barnyards and Backyards Live. And so we have a website just for that. For these shows, we're recording these shows, we're posting them back up there. If there's any reference material, we're linking that there. Get up there and see what the new schedule is for the rest of this spring. And then you can watch past shows, even the last 2 years that we've been doing this. Those are archived and in on there for you. So get in there, take a look at that. We really, we put that up there just for you. Matt also said that there's a weed and pest district essentially they are counties. So there's a weed and pest office in every county of the state. Get in there, see them, talk to them specifically for your county. Some counties, as he mentioned, has rental equipment. Some sell seed to help you get something established on your property. They sell chemical. They help recommend management strategies on your field. They'll even come out and do a site visit and help you understand what weeds you have, how to control those and that. So they are a valuable resource. So there's one in every county. Look up your local weed and pest office. Also, we have extension offices in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. Feel free to come in and talk to us. We're really good at helping. We work in partnership with the weed and pest offices, and we help pass clientele back and forth wherever we can help those people. So we, as extension, we help identify weeds. We help recommend weed management plans. And then at that point, we usually send them over to the weed and pest office to round out that management plan. And then the last thing is evaluations. If you have a few minutes and would be willing to fill out the evaluations, we'd really appreciate it. We do these programs just for you guys, and that evaluation is good feedback to us to know and help steer this program. With that, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you being here. You guys have a good rest of your Friday and a good weekend. Thank you, Matt.
Yep, thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks, Matt.